everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Chat. I have another fantastic author for you guys to meet today, and we are going to be talking about his work, his book, and anything else that comes up in casual conversation. So let me bring in Arthur.
Hi.
So Arthur, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing journey.
Well, I think I was a teacher for a long period of time. I was a head of school for a long period of time. But even when I was a kid, I was interested in these kinds of spiritual topics. I think the beginning was watching Jeffrey Hunter and King of Kings. I think it was all of maybe 10 or 11 years old. And then Jeffrey Hunter went on to be resurrected as Christopher Pike in the pilot for Star Trek. And then I also got hooked on this TV show, Kung Fu, which some of your listeners may remember. David Carradine played this Chinese monk who was basically in exile in the Wild West. And I don't know what it is, but it really lit some kind of a fire of curiosity or whatever. And I started thinking seriously about those kinds of questions even since then. So the book came about once I was retired to be able to reflect on the process by which I tried to come to my own beliefs. And, there are a lot of spiritual books out there, and they all tell you what to do, and all you have to do is follow them, and you'll achieve enlightenment or nirvana or redemption or whatever you want to call it. And I really believe, especially the teacher in me, really believes that it's not for anybody to tell anybody what to believe or to do, but to lay out the information, allow people to come to their own conclusions. If they have questions, you can try to answer them. But as the Buddha said, we all have a responsibility, be ye lamps unto yourselves. And in Christianity, Martin Luther says basically exactly the same thing, that everybody has an obligation to read the Bible for themselves and to come to their own conclusions. So that's how I got to here. And I'm sure the Holy Spirit is working its magic, and that's why I'm on this program.
Nice. And for everybody listening, we're talking about his book, A Theology for the Rest of Us, right?
Correct.
So when did you begin to write this book?
Well, like I said, I probably began to write it when I was 10 years old because I started having those kinds of questions. But formally, I started writing a couple of years ago. And I always liked to write. So that part of it was easy. But being a teacher and a head of school, I would have people ask me different kinds of questions. And frankly, they would ask me questions that they were embarrassed to ask whoever it was, the leader of their congregation, whatever it was, because they had doubts and they didn't want to look dumb and they didn't want to look ignorant. And they certainly didn't want to look like they lacked faith, because that's something that very few congregations would tolerate. So I basically would answer those questions, and I realized, they're not the only ones, and I'm not the only one. And I think society in general frowns on people thinking for themselves. So as much as everybody says, I want to be unique, I want to be unique, I want to be different, I want to be my own person, etc. For the most people, I want to be unique just so long as everybody likes me and agrees with me. So the thrust of the book is to basically give people permission to investigate things on their own terms, come to their own conclusions, and that it's really okay. And if you do that, you find you may lose people who used to be friends or used to share views, but you will also find kindred spirits out there who will be supportive and helpful and cooperative. And at the end of the day, you'll be more you, more authentically you, and that's a good thing.
That is good. I like how you have portrayed that in your work, because that, growing up, asking uncomfortable questions like that, things that we didn't know that a lot of us felt like we should know,
right?
Those were hard to go up and ask people for. And I growing up in Oklahoma, it's part of the Bible Belt. Like, I remember feeling that myself, during church services when I was younger. So that's actually kind of cool that you had to address that with this book. So
how did you get past that? I can't imagine the chapter goddess stayed in that position, afraid to ask questions.
I was actually really shy as a younger kid. I was one of those kids I didn't like to read aloud or talk aloud or like bring any attention to myself. I actually had my sixth grade teacher put me in front of the classroom and stand at the back because my mom was also a teacher and she saw me in school. She was like, okay, I want you to yell at me like you yell at your little brother and sister. It's like, no. And I guess after like coming out of my shell with that, it kind of made it easier to ask. So, and I really dove into like, I guess, researching for myself and looking for those answers myself. It's different when that like clicks on in your brain to start looking for stuff versus just like going with what exactly you're told. So,
well, the Hindus would say that which you are seeking is causing you to seek. There's some part of you that's connected. I mean, I don't know if it sounds pretentious, but there's some part of you, of all of us, that's connected with this divine that, permeates the universe.
Yeah.
And, it's attracted to you. And, whatever inhibitions we have, whatever potentially embarrassing thoughts we may have, we have a choice to either give in to them or pursue what we are thinking about and considering, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah. And something I want to bring up too, you mentioned in the document you filled out is listening to your inner voice and resisting temptations to conform to accepted standards. What kind of did you mean by that? Let's kind of like dive into that.
Well, like I said, first off, there are lots of pressures to conform. Babies who don't conform die. It's really that simple. So they have to. There's a reason why babies are cute and smile, because evolution people will tell you, otherwise they don't survive. So this is all part of the DNA. People don't have claws, not particularly strong or anything like that. So people who are on their own die. It's really that basic and biologically simple. So how do people survive? How do people thrive? They survive and thrive by making social connections. They develop communities. So one guy up against a mastodon is not going to make it. But you get a group of people up against a mastodon, then they have a chance. And basically all of history is the detailing of all these societies getting together and overcoming obstacles and becoming effective societies. With that as the psychological and evolutionary background, the pressure against being an individual is enormous. I mean, there's all kinds of pressure to fit in. I mean, I taught for years and years, and there's nothing like giving teenagers permission to be themselves. Probably one of the best kinds of conversations I would have is how teens would twist themselves into all kinds of contortions in order to please everybody else. And I would ask them, so what are you afraid of? They said, well, they're not going to like me and they're going to hurt me and they're going to do this and that. I said, well, just understand that by doing all this stuff, you are doing to yourself what you are afraid other people are going to do to you. And is that worth it to you? So, that's the kind of pressure we're all under. At the same time, there is a part of us, and you had that experience yourself, and just about everybody has it. Soren Kierkegaard, which is a great name to drop at a cocktail party or something like that. It sounds really cool. But Soren Kierkegaard will talk about this feeling, and he calls it a fear and trembling. And St. John of the Cross will call it the dark night of the soul. And all these different people will have different expressions for it. And some people will do whatever they can to quash it. They'll become workaholics or alcoholics or sexaholics or whatever it is. They'll do whatever it is to squash it because it's threatening their sense of identity. It's threatening their sense of conformity. And ultimately, it could be perceived as a threat to their survival. So, to be in a congregation in a town where you grew up and all your friends believe X and your parents have told you X and, etc. And to start thinking why, that's tough. On the other hand, it's tough not to, because people are denying a key part of themselves. And that's always painful. And always a losing game.
Gosh. Yeah. So When did the inspiration hit you to put everything you've learned regarding this down into a book? Like, what was that like? Was it like an epiphany or like a light bulb going off in your head? Like, I need to put this down?
No, I think it started the actual process of the writing, even though these kinds of ideas had been circulating for a long time. I think the actual writing started with the pandemic, because I think, again, the pandemic brought a sense of insecurity. Now, insecurity is usually seen as a negative thing. I'm scared, I'm frightened, I don't know what to do, I'm confused, et cetera, et cetera. But insecurity can also be a means to exploration. You're insecure, you have to find ways of feeling more secure. So people would express questions that were unsettling to them, and needed a safe environment to do so. And once the pandemic hit, people had to confront different kinds of fears separate from everybody else because of the lockdowns, et cetera. The social interaction that people had depended upon was no longer as powerful as it had been before. Now, I'm no doubt about it. Some people would say, Arthur, you're narcissistic and you're an only child and a male on top of that, and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not so narcissistic to say that the whole divine power in the universe orchestrated this pandemic just to get me to write this book. Having said that, once you tap into the senses of insecurity and people expressing themselves, then there's it's kind of like anybody who creates anything, painting, songs, dance, whatever it is, nobody really knows where that inspiration comes from, because if they did, they'd identify it, bottle it, and make a ton of money on it, because it just doesn't work that way. You just start doing things. And in Taoism, the phrase is, the longest journey starts with a single step. And a word that's used in the West a lot is lost. I'm lost. I need to find myself, all those kinds of phrases. And I think this psychology needs to change to where you're not lost, but you are at a particular place at a particular time, and you need to identify a direction. So I basically just started writing. One idea led to the other. I just kept writing. I used to teach, formal essay writing in classes way back when. And, my students will laugh. They'll say, well, you're following the same model you taught us. And I said, yeah, well, that's all I know. So that's how it comes out that way. And then, as silly as it sounds, so I write this book, and it's not a long book. I mean, it's scary. It's scary for me that the original manuscript was like 50 pages. And I'm, 69. It was scary to think I've been thinking about this my entire life. It came out to less than 1 page a year. So there's not a whole lot of learning there. But I said, okay, so how do you publish books? So I went to Google like everybody does, and I find a list of publishers of religious books. And the first one, MSI Press, responds positively. I said, well, this is a breeze. People say this stuff, publishing is hard. This was the very first one I found. It was the top of the list on Google. So I kept sending them out. Well, this one went out of business. This one didn't care. This one said it wasn't Christian enough. This one said it was too general, and blah, blah, blah. So the universe had this way, Arthur, you thought this was going to be a breeze. Be grateful that you found one, because you only need one. And sure enough, that's exactly how it happened. So I worked through, and even that was kind of weird, because in the book I make some references to Russian literature, in particular Fyodor Dostoevsky, another name to drop at a cocktail party. And the publisher, Betty Lever at MSI Press, she's a graduate of Moscow University, and had all this interest in Russian literature and things like that. And she says, anybody who can mention somebody like Dostoevsky now, as opposed to in the 1800s, there's got to be something worthwhile there. So it was, it was like kismet. You make these connections, and I got to tell you, as weird as it sounds, and trust me, I am not a kumbaya mystical person. I research everything, and I make my little spreadsheets and pros and cons and all this kind of stuff. Nevertheless, I really have come to believe that you have an idea, you have something you want to find out about, you have some kind of inkling, and you pursue it. All of a sudden, stuff starts to happen in the universe that allows you to fulfill it. For somebody as risk averse as me, to be able to spend 2 years in Singapore, I mean, there's just no way, simply no way. I was at the end of my career, and I'm thinking of retiring, and what am I going to do, et cetera. I get this call from somebody I had worked with 40 years ago in Chicago. He's got this program in Singapore. He knows I'm about to retire. What do you say? I could easily imagine God up in heaven going, well, you know how this guy Yavelberg is so interested in Eastern religions. There's no way he's going to go out there on his own. It's got to be safe. It's got to be easy, all these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be in English. I had never even heard of Singapore before. I thought Singapore and Shanghai and Hong Kong was all the same place, just different languages. And Singapore is amazing. Everything is beautiful. It's clean. It's in English. And it's a gateway to all of Asia. Anything you want to see, it's like Asia Light. Anything you want to see in Singapore, anything you want to see, China, Japan, Australia, anything you find in miniature form in Singapore. And if you want to go see the real thing, like I was able to go to Cambodia to see Angkor Wat, where people, the fans of Lara Croft will remember where she filmed first of the Tomb Raider movies. I mean, it's amazing. And I look back at that, and I can look back at any number of other things and say, yeah, logically, plausibly, that should never have happened. And I believe everybody can look back on their lives and look at those things and say, yeah, that logically that never should have happened. I couldn't have predicted this 5 years ago.
Yeah, but I bet you're glad you went there, because that sounds amazing. Like, it sounds very pretty, and I love to investigate different cultures myself, and that's on my bucket list, is to travel more, and I'm slowly getting there. But yeah, it's kind of a crazy world we live in now. So
yeah, and you have to look, like everything, you have to weigh the risks and all the rest of it. But the perspective I always use when people would say stuff like you just said, some opportunity comes up and you're deciding whether or not to do that. As morbid as it sounds, I want you to picture yourself on your deathbed and you're looking back at this moment, and are you going to be happy or sad with whatever choice you made? And once you look at it that way, you realize not only that you have the ability to make choices you might not have considered, but you don't have forever.
Yeah.
You have an X number of options that will come our way. And when that's it, that's it.
And it's actually kind of difficult to get your mind to switch to thinking like that, because I've tried to, especially since the pandemic happened, shift to thinking if I want to go do something, probably need to figure out how to do that. If I'm going to travel the world, try to figure out how to do that within a budget and reasonable time. Because if you keep putting it off, I'll go then, you may never go. So.
Well, the reservation you're feeling goes back to what I was saying earlier about survival. Yeah. People who are cautious, people who are investigating potential risks and that kind of thing, they have a better survival rate because they're not taking risks. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the goal is not simply to survive. The goal is to live a life that is satisfying and has the opportunity to be authentically who we are. It's not just about endurance. Mm-hmm. We could live till 90 and stay in our closets and, never venture out.
Yeah.
We could make it to 90. Yeah, so what?
Yeah. It's not worth it if you haven't lived a little. So,
Correct.
which, I mean, there's within good means, like living
Yeah,
well.
it is. It is, and it's naive of people to think there is no risk. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is, don't expect to venture out on your own and come up with your own ideas and your own practices that are different from those of your friends and neighbors and family, and have everybody all of a sudden bow in awe and say, "Oh my God, what a wonderful thing you've just learned." It's going to yield, in many cases, a lot of resentment and all that kind of thing, because by you exploring on your own, other people are going to find it threatening, because that means they have to challenge what they believe, and they don't want to do that. So, yeah, it's a risk. Here's another implausibility. I'm going to go to Egypt in a month. I'm going to go to Egypt. I got this thing in the mail. Things are half price because of the pandemic and all this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking to myself, practicing what I preach, there's a part of me that says, how are you going to go to Egypt? Who knows what kind of pavements they have in terms of walking and this and that. But Arthur, you're on your deathbed. You're looking back on this moment. Are you going to wish that you had taken the chance? No, I can go there, and who knows what's going to happen? I could get sick. I could do this. I could do that. But in a very rational cost-benefit analysis, the odds are in my favor.
Yeah.
And you know what? And if something horrible happens, and who knows, I'm still going to be able to say, yeah, I gave it my best shot. Nietzsche is this German philosopher of the 1800s. Mm-hmm. Basically, his answer to just about everything is, did you tell the truth? More important, did you tell your truth? Because to the extent that you didn't, you're already dead. You're already dead. Shakespeare has this line, a hero dies, no, cowards die 1,000 deaths. The hero dies but once. It's absolutely true, right? It's absolutely true. You live your truth. You do what you feel like you need to do. And if the bottom falls out, the bottom falls out, but you gave it your best shot, as opposed to always playing it safe and, always getting a C+. Yeah, so what?
Yeah. So when you finished this book, did you find yourself eager to write like another book?
No, like I said, it took me, I was able to put out less than 1 page a year, and I'm not living till 134, so it's not happening. But I think part of it also has to do with what the feedback is to this book. If people, read it, again, practicing what I preach. If people pick up the book, or publishers pick up the book and they say, you know what, this is nonsense and this doesn't work, et cetera, fine. I gave it my best shot, and it doesn't work, it didn't work. On the other hand, if people pick up the book and find it helpful, and one of the nicest comments I've heard in context with the book is that it's not preachy. It doesn't tell people what to believe, and it makes these ideas that are kind of complicated and sophisticated comprehensible, accessible. So if people have other questions that they want, direction with, who knows? I mean, I don't close any doors, but for right now, I'm finding satisfaction in getting the responses I've gotten and the kinds of questions where people feel safe to, speak their minds and disagree or agree and whatever. Whereas before, I think those people just basically stayed quiet and numbed themselves to the kinds of questions that they had.
During the story, did you reflect or share on any personal experiences?
Yeah. Well, the Singapore one was a big one, but the other thing, so I was in high school. How did I start I grew up, my parents were both Jewish, but neither one was formally religiously interested. My father was a devout atheist and had no use for anything like that. My mother was from Mexico, and she was basically very superstitious. I don't know that she would think in terms of theology, but if there was some amulet or ring that was said to bring good luck, she was all over it and would have 16 of those and that kind of thing. And this is this is going to sound common. I met this girl in high school, and she was interested in Bible studies and some Bible class. Well, I didn't know anything,
Yeah.
but I was interested in her. So all of a sudden, I was interested in Bible class. So I went with her to this Bible class, and I remember the teacher was talking about the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, and they weren't supposed to eat of the fruit of this tree, and they did, and because of that, they were cast out of the garden. So I'm listening to this, and I said, wait a minute. If a parent, if a kid burns his hand on a stove that's lit, it's not the kid's fault. It's the parent's fault. So if God didn't want him to eat of this fruit of the tree of knowledge and the stakes were so high, what's he doing planting a tree like that right in the middle of the garden where they can see it just about every day? So the teacher looks at me and looks at the girl and says, where did you dig him up from? But, again, one thing led to another. And I met this person who was a teacher whose wife contacted the seminary. I had a job at the time. I was going to pursue, I took a civil service job with the Social Security Administration, and I could speak Spanish. My mother was Mexican, so my Spanish was good. And in Florida, you can imagine being able to speak Spanish is a big advantage. That would have been very safe. I could have stayed there. My mother was happy. People were happy. Put in my 20 years, retire, typical story, and nothing would have happened. But there was a part of me that said, yeah, you don't want to do that. You have a chance here to do something different that could be really satisfying. And I got to tell you, so this was back in the 70s. I get on a plane for New York, and I'm going to go to Columbia and to the seminary. I get off the plane, I get a cab, I'm going to go to the seminary. Well, New York was a pit in the 70s. I mean, an absolute pit. A Beam was like mayor, and crime was rampant. Times Square was a jungle. I mean, it was terrible. So I'm going in the cab from LaGuardia Airport up to the, Washington Heights, I think it's called, like 122nd Street and Broadway. And I'm passing graffiti and iron bars on windows. I mean, it looks like I got off the plane in Beirut or something like that. And it was scary. And I get off the cab, and there's bars on the door, and the security guard comes out. And I'm thinking, boy, did I make a doozy of a mistake. I didn't even buy a round trip ticket. So, and yet, that was the first step in this whole transition where I wound up becoming a teacher, and then I had a school and all that stuff that came afterwards. Whereas there was a big part of me that said, get back in the cab, turn around, and figure out how to get your rear end back to Miami, where you had this nice, safe Social Security job. I didn't. But I could have, and my guess is a number of people in that kind of situation would have. And yet, I look back now, and I'm glad I made the choice. But at the time, it wasn't such an easy choice.
Yeah, those are never easy choices. I'm sitting here thinking, like, okay, how many times have I had that same thought in life? And I'm like, okay, wait, we're fixing to do something big. Like, if I'm questioning it this much, something is coming out of this. So
it's percolating.
Yes. Take a deep breath and just keep moving forward.
Absolutely. And you have to overcome that upbringing and social context, that you have to rationally look at that stuff and say, yeah, I get it. This is where my fear is coming from. This is where my insecurity is. And I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah. And it is scary putting yourself out there, but you make a difference when you do.
You make a difference to everybody else and you. What's his name? I can see him. There's this great statement, be yourself, everybody else is taken. You have this, everybody has this unique ability and contribution to make. And to the degree we squash it in order to conform to everybody else, we not only deny ourselves, but we also deny everybody else the opportunity to benefit from what we have to offer. So, it's win-win when we tell our truth. It's lose-lose when we don't.
Yeah. Well, Arthur, we have reached the end of our time. So go ahead and tell our listeners and viewers where they can find your wonderful book.
So there's Amazon.com. I now have a website now.
Yeah.
It's very creative and original. It's ArthurYavelberg.com. It's apparently that's how this stuff is supposed to work. But it's available through Amazon. It's available through MSI Press. There are links on the website too. I have a Facebook group. People are free to join. One of the nicest things that's come out of this whole experience is people I never would have met beforehand contacting me and changing views and this and that. And that's been very gratifying. Feeling like I've made some kind of a difference in people's lives, which is great.
Well, thank you again.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I wish you luck, and I hope to follow your program and see more of what you have to offer to all of your viewers.
Awesome.